Hi, I'm Bernd Prünster, and I'm going to present Total Eclipse of the Heart, Disrupting the Interplanetary File System. So what is the Interplanetary File System, or IPFS? IPFS is a peer-to-peer hypermedia system. Its development is held by protocol labs, and parts of IPFS are used extensively by other systems. The reason why this works so well is it's fully decentralized and open and very modular, which means you have different subsystems interacting with each other based on well-defined APIs. And this whole architecture is extensible. So if you want to mount your decentralized peer-to-peer application, you can just use IPFS, add your subsystem for your application layer magic, and be done with it. Because IPFS just works. And I say that wholly unironically, it really does. So this is the greatest feat IPFS managed to pull off, in my opinion, because you can just fire up a node, join the network, and you're done, and it works. You have connectivity, you can share files, you can partake in whatever's happening. And this is a feat of engineering nobody else before has managed to pull off. So in effect, IPFS wants to go from something like this, which is your typical IP layer topology, which requires a seasoned exorcist to cast out its demons, to something like this, which actually makes sense to a normal human being and is comprehensible by both man and machine. Having introduced IPFS, I will need to talk about the decentralized operation of peer-to-peer systems before I can talk about IPFS specifics. And finally, I'll explain how we managed to pull off dirt cheap Eclipse attacks on live IPFS nodes. So how do you operate a decentralized peer-to-peer system in the wild? First of all, some basics. You don't have IP layer information anymore, you have abstract identifiers. In this case, A, B, O, and C. And of course, this information needs to be mapped to IP layer information such that it actually works in the real world. And we will focus on our node A here, which has learned the IP layer information about B, C, and O out of band. And in order to partake in a peer-to-peer network, it contacts those nodes it knows and queries for IP layer information on itself. And these nodes respond with other node information, and gradually A learns more and more IP layer information and builds its routing table. And that's what's called bootstrapping, which is basically the process of joining a peer-to-peer network. And once you've joined the network, you can go ahead and query for information. For example, S, this could be the hash of some data or the ID of some node you want to contact. So A asks the nodes about S, and they reply with some other nodes. And finally, A reaches S and can connect, which is nice. And the reason why this converges is that all the nodes have agreed on a common distance metric. And this works for finding nodes and data. And this system as a whole is called the distributed hash table. The data is identified by hashes, basically. And this works well as long as nobody goes ahead and claims identifiers already taken. So obviously, you need to do something about that. We need to lay out some very fundamental peer-to-peer security techniques. You definitely need self-certifying identifiers to fix identifier theft. So you generate a public-private key pair for each node, derive its ID from a public key, and you authenticate all connections, and you're basically done with it. And it definitely works. So each identifier in the network is now verified, which is nice, except, well, it's really not, because all those nodes could be operated by a single entity, which makes your network collapse. So that's what's called a Sybil attack, and that works because all you know is identifiers and not whether these identifiers are actually owned by distinct entities. And this is, of course, devastating for any peer-to-peer network. But there's another fundamental class of attacks that has been haunting peer-to-peer networks basically since their inception. So I have my self-certifying identifier, so I can't just choose arbitrary identifiers. But I can go ahead and regenerate identifiers, brute force it basically, until I have arrived with enough identifiers close to some target that my evil nodes are closest to this target. If anybody queries for K now, all the requests for K will terminate at my nodes, and I can simply pretend K does not exist. And that's what's called an Eclipse attack. And this is basically what we managed to pull off against IPFS. So how can these problems be fixed? Well, Eskademlia proposed a solution to these issues. use self-certifying identifiers, mandate disjoint lookup paths, and a centralized or proof-of-work-based identifier generation. And I mention escademia specifically because the IPFS white paper cites this strategy. But let's talk some more IPFS specific. Let's talk connection management. IPFS is supposed to just work, and in order to achieve that, it needs to natively support relaying and net traversal. It's connection-oriented, so nodes need to limit the number of active connections in order not to become overburdened, but still remain connected to the network. So nodes need to gauge the importance of connections, and they employ a simple but effective scoring system to do that. In a sense, keep important connections, trim the unimportant ones. But there's a peculiarity to this. This system needs to respect all present and future subsystems, because as I've mentioned, IPFS is extensible, so you can mount any application layer logic on top of it, and you don't want your important connections to be trimmed. And they have introduced a connection manager to tackle this issue. So how does it work? Well, first of all, the connection manager sorts all connections by score, which is just the sum of points from all subsystems. Usually this is something like 15 or 20 or 10 or something like that. Then it counts the connections. And if the number of connections is higher than a configurable high water mark, it goes ahead and trims the lowest scored ones down to the second configurable threshold. Then it sleeps in 1 minute and it does it all over again. So you can configure the maximum and the minimum amount of connections you want to keep. And this works quite well. So how did we manage to pull off Eclipse attacks on IPFS? Well, we pre-generated identifiers. And if you want to eclipse some target, you just pick an ID, search through the ID pool, you obtain loads and loads of identifiers that are very close to the target, closer than the rest of the network. Then you spawn Sybil nodes, assign them those IDs, you connect to the victim. Yeah, well, and then you need some magic incantation to make the connection manager actually trim all the honest connections. And we managed to do that within minutes. So how did we go about this? Well, of course, we inflated the score of high water many of our evil connections such that the honest ones are just trimmed. And one ingredient is our pre-generated identifiers. They are so close to the target identifier in comparison to the rest of the network that we get awarded quite a high amount of points just because we are so close to the victim. Then there's BitSwap, similar to what BitTorrent does. And you also get some points for unsolicited advertisement of content. So yeah, a couple of points for free, basically, because it doesn't consume any resources. And then there's the relaying subsystem. And this is really a goldmine because relaying is important for IPFS to work in the wild. So we just went ahead and relayed junk connections over our one of our evil connections to inflate our score to infinity and beyond, basically, because it awards 1 point per connection. So while this sounds like really a cheap source of points, it's a bit more intricate because this is resource consuming also for the target. So if your attacking machine is pretty powerful, you can end up DOSing your target even if you don't want to. But in the end, you own a node. That's basically it. You eclipse it. So within minutes, the DHT is poisoned, and within less than an hour, no honest connections to this node are present anymore. Aren't there any easy defenses? Yeah, well, you don't want Sybil attacks, and you don't want cheap identifier generation. But the thing is, you do not want the full Sybil resistance, because if you really manage to do that each machine is represented by a single identity, well, either it's unmanageable or you run into trouble, because IPv4 is still a thing, and if you manage a couple of IPFS nodes running at a company, for example, it will still be one public IPv4 address. So you would basically lock out all these machines behind the last hop at the company. You don't want that. Plus, full Sybil resistance is an illusion anyways. So, but what about proof of work-based defenses? Well, the thing is, you can't do that. It's conceptually impossible. If you want an HPC node to be able to join the network and the cheap smartphone to be able to join the network, how much work can you mandate for identifier generation? This is a gap that's simply put impossible to close. You can't do that, so that's also not an issue. So where does that put IPFS today? Our original work was carried out in 2020, and we crashed and burned a couple of times trying to submit our paper. So a lot of time has passed, and in the meantime, lots of things have happened. First of all, we'd like to thank Protocol Labs for their support, because they were nothing but professional and forthcoming and supportive throughout our research. They allowed us to test out our attack against some of their bootstrap nodes, which were pre-configured for all their IPFS nodes out there. So essentially, they let us hammer critical infrastructure. So they revised the scoring system for DHT connections and relays, but that's a delicate subject on its own, because you need to be really, really careful not to screw this up such that actually important connections remain. Also, their DHT implementation manages to actually discriminate between connections that are useless and connections that are actually useful. The IPFS DHT is probably the most robust and best DHT implementation you will find out there. So if you want a DHT, you can go ahead and use that. Then there were a slew of other changes to harden the system, and they made some infrastructure tweaks to their bootstrap nodes. So in effect, taking out a single node and fully eclipsing it now takes days and not mere minutes as before. But yeah, that's basically the gist of it. There's much more that happened in the background. And again, very grateful to Protocol Labs in supporting this research. And yeah, that's all for my part. I'll be here on Zoom taking questions.